So the last presentation today is by Christopher Glaisek, who is Vice President of Planning and Design at Waterfront Toronto, which I hope all of you know, has been doing extraordinary work in our city. Probably the first piece of city building that we've seen in a long time that has vision. I was telling Christopher, I go apoplectic when I hear certain politicians saying, why have we spent this much money on the waterfront? And I feel like saying, go down there and see, and you will know that good work takes effort, and it takes investment, and it takes commitment, which I think Waterfront Toronto has been remarkable about doing. He's a strong promoter of sustainable city building whose professional goal is to make great urban neighborhoods come to life. He is responsible for conceiving all planning and design initiatives and managing detailed design for the Waterfront Toronto projects, including the 2,000-acre, which are encompassed in the 2,000-acre designated waterfront area. And before coming to Waterfront Toronto, what's interesting is that Chris has had a long involvement in large and complex city building agencies. He's a graduate of Yale School of Architecture and was the VP of Planning and Design. Was VP of Planning, Design, and Development for the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation, which emerged post 9/11, and was also Director of Planning to develop the winning bid for New York City to be to be the first North American city to be shortlisted for exactly, candidate city is the term I was looking for. Under Chris's stewardship, Waterfront Toronto has received more than 50 national and international design awards and nominations for its master plans, parks, and streetscapes. And I was really, I think, excited to have Chris here because I think it really speaks to the kind of complexity that was alluded to this morning and was also alluded to, I think, this afternoon, of how that it's a very complex and multivalent process of getting projects built, and that architects wear many hats, and I think Chris exemplifies those many hats. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Lola. It's nice to be here. It doesn't seem like very long ago I was sitting where you are, listening to people who seem to know what they were doing with their lives come and speak to me about how to have a terrific career. And when Lola asked me to come teach professional or speak at a professional practice class, my first thought was, there's nothing professional about me. I just kind of make this stuff up as I go day by day. And I said the same thing to my planning professor from Yale, and he said, yeah, but you're actually doing it. You are making it happen. So I guess I'm lucky in that I am getting to make it happen. And there's no clear path to doing this sort of work. It's kind of fallen into my lap in some ways through happenstance. I don't think you can map out a career path that says I'm going to work on large-scale urban revitalization projects necessarily, but I'll explain how I got there, and maybe it will give you a little bit of sense of perspective as you move through your own career. I mean, my interest in architecture actually started when my parents took me to Expo 67 in Montreal when I was just a little kid, and I fell in love with the whole idea of, well, I thought I fell in love with the idea of architecture, but I only realized many years later that what Expo got me to fall in love with was the idea of urban environments. So it took me a long time to realize that that was in fact what I wanted to do, because I thought I wanted to be an architect from the time I was a very little kid. But then I went to Brown as an undergrad and decided I was also very interested in history and social history, and so I got a degree in that and started a career as a museum curator, and by happenstance ended up working at the New York City Parks Department as a preservation person, and then that morphed into doing park planning. And I got very interested in the process of identifying land for potential parks, of making a case for acquiring the land, developing the land, turning it into a park, how you work with communities and actually building something that people want. And one of the great things about New York is it's got a terrific tradition of building public parks that actually have the things in them that people want and are not just pastoral landscapes that are dreamt up by landscape architects. So I got a lot of exposure to that whole process of engaging the public and building a city that reflects what people are interested in. But one thing I learned while I was there was that planners, which is really what I was doing, don't really know anything about design, and yet they make huge numbers of what are in fact design decisions, though they either don't realize it or don't acknowledge that that's what they're doing. They will say, well, these are just the planning parameters, and then the designers can come in later and make it work. And I thought, well, no, I think the designers can actually come in and solve some of the problems and bring a different perspective to how to solve them than the planners are bringing in. And I really felt there was a terrible disconnect between the planning profession and the architecture, landscape architecture profession, and I still believe there is a terrible disconnect between those two, but I think there are signs of life and hope. I think the waterfront in Toronto is one case where we're starting to bridge that gap. So that led me to decide many, many years after first thinking I would go to architecture school to finally go to architecture school. So I worked for 5 years in New York City and then went to Yale. And got very interested in design and architecture, and I really thought, okay, I'm going to become an architect. I've done enough of this urban planning stuff, and that whole idea of combining the two fields was kind of nice, but enough is enough. I'd love to design some buildings, and I was very fortunate in that the one planning course I took, taught by Alex Garvin, while I was a student of his, he was asked to plan a bid for hosting the Olympics in New York City, which most people thought was a kind of crazy idea, but having worked at the New York City Parks Department and understanding the incredible inventory of recreational facilities that New York's got and the scale at which they were built, which was almost unprecedented in the world. I'll give you one great example. Astoria Park has a pool, a public pool. It was actually the size of 5 Olympic swimming pools built by Robert Moses, so that the people of New York would have a free place to go and cool off. And people said, where will you fit the Olympics? How could you fit the Olympics? And I said, well, Astoria Park, you got 5 Olympic swimming pools right there. That's more than you need for the Olympics. Maybe we can just rebuild them. So he offered me a job working with him, and I couldn't say no because the possibilities were so endless. And so I did that job for a while. We did a bid. We had to beat out 7 other American cities that were competing to get selected by the U.S. to then go into the international competition. And we won that bid. We put together a really great plan, and even in a city like New York where everybody has different opinions, we did enough consultation in the neighborhoods that we generally had public support for doing the project, which was kind of amazing even to me. But it's because we were going to use most of the money for the facilities, not to build a fancy standalone Olympic Center way out in the middle of nowhere, but to do things like renovate city parks, including Astoria Park and Pool, which had not had a major renovation since it was built in the 1930s and wasn't even able to be fully opened anymore. So we said, well, we'll make this the designated spot for the Olympics, and we'll leave behind a legacy of a couple of fantastic Olympic caliber swimming pools, which will go back to being accessible to the public. Unfortunately, we did not win that international bid, but I was not part of the team that put that together, because right after we submitted our bid to be the U.S. city, 9/11 happened, and the World Trade Center was destroyed, and everyone was desperately trying to figure out what to do. Should we rebuild them as they were? Some people were saying, let's dust off the original plans and put them back exactly the way they were, which had a certain emotional appeal, but certainly didn't deal with any of the urban problems that the World Trade Center had posed. And we were fortunate enough that everyone kind of said, the guys who were doing that Olympic bid, they should be the guys who figure out what to do with the World Trade Center site. So our whole planning unit from the Olympics was basically hired away from that effort, and we switched over to working on Lower Manhattan, which ironically enough, we had just moved into a building in Lower Manhattan, so we only had to move across the street to continue to work on a completely different project. And that was a whole other level of architecture and planning and community consultation on a very different scale, because we had to deal with interest groups that were composed of family members of people who had died in the World Trade Center site. So we would have consultations about urban plans and design issues, and we'd start those meetings off with a moment of silence. There was usually some crying involved when you talked about certain topics about, you know, well, it'll be 82 floors high and someone lost their husband on the 82nd floor type of thing. So it gives you a very different perspective on what this stuff actually means to people, and that it has a lot of meaning beyond what we might focus on when we're doing these as design exercises ourselves. So I worked on that for 3 years. I ran the competition that led to the selection of the Daniel Libeskind master plan for the site. That too grew out of, I would say, public consultation more than anything. We had done the kind of normal route of round up a bunch of design options from 1 or 2 designers. We hired a couple of them, and we had them each invent alternatives. And they're never as credible as when you have 6 different architects come up with 6 alternatives that each of them believes in. So when we were criticized that the original designs were boring, I said, let's do a design competition. Let's not have one firm do 6 alternatives. Let's have 6 great firms do 6 alternatives. And that's what we did, and we held an exhibition of that, and the Libeskind plan, I think, had won the popular vote and also won the kind of first prize, if you want to call it that, from our jury, and that became the plan that went forward. Unfortunately, Danielle did not get hired to design any of the buildings, so I would say that it looks nothing like it was supposed to look like in that plan. But that's a good example of what Alar was talking about, where when you think everything's going fine, you still have to be ready for it not to be. I think Danielle thought he was going to build the whole thing. We would have had this singular vision for the site. Instead, what's actually happened on the World Trade Center site is you look, so all the other people who were in that competition who lost each got to do a building. So Norman Foster didn't win, he's doing a building. SOM didn't win, they're doing a building. Raphael Vignoli didn't win, he's doing a building. And Daniel Libeskind's doing nothing except saying that the master plan was his, which it was, but it looks very different than it was intended to look. And that's where you need somebody in a role who's going to oversee that and make that vision stay alive all the way to the end. And it's an incredibly hard job. And I think, you know, probably one of the things that you will need most in your career, that you probably spend the least amount of time thinking about in school, is presenting your ideas in a compelling way. So like I'm up here talking to you now, this is what I do all the time. I get up in front of people and I talk, and I'm usually trying to convince them that we should do a design competition or we should support this great design even though it might cost a little more money. And if you can't do that, you're not going to get all that far with your ideas. I think the World Trade Center is a great example. Whether you love the design or not, it was a very powerful set of images that should have carried itself forward, and it didn't. Speculate about whose fault that is, but that's kind of what happened. So you need to be able to be an effective advocate for the design ideas that you do have. And you have to convince not only other architects, which is who we normally talk to, who already sort of get it. You have to convince people who don't know anything about design, don't know anything about architecture, don't know anything about planning, don't know anything about economics even, although there are many people who claim to know about that, but what they actually do is they just say, gee, that looks expensive. Let's not do that, it looks expensive. The way things look isn't necessarily what they cost, and spending the same amount of money on 2 different versions of something can give 2 very different economic results, so you have to be able to make all of those arguments as well. So after working on the World Trade Center site for 3 years and kind of learning all of that, or getting exposed to that, I was interested in not being in New York anymore. I'd spent a lot of time dealing with really hard stuff there, and my wife was from Toronto, and I started looking for work in New York and also here, and the position on the waterfront opened up. And what was amazing about that position is how similar it was to working on the World Trade Center site, because we had a very politically contentious project here in Toronto, the waterfront. Everybody has an opinion and thinks that everyone else's opinion is wrong, or at least that's what it was like when I arrived here, which is exactly how it was on the World Trade Center site. People were very emotional about it. There was a huge amount of money involved. The World Trade Center was a $1.2 billion government package of money that we were given to use to revitalize the site in Lower Manhattan. Waterfront Toronto had $1.5 billion to do a revitalization of the waterfront. So those political skills translated very well here, and one of the first things I did was a design competition for Queens Quay. So I'm going to just show you kind of the evolution of some of the work that we've done here, and then I will stop talking. Just to give you a sense of the size of this waterfront project, Toronto is incredibly ambitious with what it set out to do when it created the Waterfront Corporation about 12 years ago. That little bubble there represents the scale of Battery Park City, very famous district that was rebuilt in Lower Manhattan. That's the size of the territory of Canary Wharf in London, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And that'd be the relative size of the designated waterfront area that we are technically responsible for revitalizing. So it's a pretty unprecedented scale of an opportunity. We don't have money to do every single square foot of this area, nor are we doing plans for every single square foot of it, but we're doing a heck of a lot of it. It is not an easy task. I've already described to you some of the things. One of the things we found here, I found here, was a lot of public cynicism. There have been many efforts to revitalize the waterfront in the past, and people said, oh yeah, why are you going to be successful? You know, X, Y, and Z Corporation tried. We had the mistake by the lake. We have the three ugly sisters, Harborfront Corporation, embezzled money, blah, 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 blah. So giving people some confidence that you're in fact going to do things right is a huge part of the job. There were many stops and starts. There were corporations created and then corporations disbanded. So again, that fed into the public cynicism, but also a sense that everything takes forever on the waterfront, which is true. Complex projects, it's a very complicated area jurisdictionally, in terms of the land use. All of this is built on landfill. So you've got bad soil, terrible subsurface conditions. You've got pollutants, contaminants. And in many cases, you're kind of working around existing fabric. It's not a completely blank slate, even though some of it looks like it. Global competition at the time for capital. We were going to need a lot of capital investment from the private sector, and we're hoping to attract that here. And this bubble always kind of makes me laugh because this is from our standard presentation, and it says limited resources. We only had $1.5 billion, which doesn't sound like that small an amount. But when you try and spread it over 2,000 acres, it actually doesn't go all that far. So how did we overcome some of these barriers? One of the key ways was through extensive consultation and collaboration. I don't think there's ever been an organization in Toronto that's consulted the public as much as we have. There was one year where we counted we had 60 public meetings in 1 year, which means more than an average of one a week, which is one evening of my life a week, and many other staff. But what we've done is we've really listened, we've responded in the plans, and that creates a kind of public momentum without which it's very hard to do these projects. If you don't have constituents for your project, it's very hard to ever get it done. We also had a comprehensive master planning approach, which really is something that Toronto has not been doing for several decades. At this point in time, the city tends to do things on a very project-by-project basis. There's not a lot of comprehensive thinking. I don't think there really has been since amalgamation. So we took on this notion, and if I were going to criticize anything, I'd say we didn't actually go big enough. We identified these precincts that were each about the size of a Battery Park City, and we did master plans for them. It's only later that I think we started to realize the need to tie them together was still pretty strong, and I think we're trying to rectify that now. But people say you don't want to think too big, but you kind of need to think big when you're taking on something that needs so much intervention in so many different places. We also, thankfully, because of some of the bad architecture, or the so-called bad architecture that had been built by our predecessors, had a mandate for good design and for bringing in world-class design talent. And a real focus on quality of place. There was a lot of public dissatisfaction with what was built before us, and that it didn't achieve the goals of good city building. It was considered much more about just letting developers make money. So our mission was to create quality of place. We're also tasked in our legislation with creating a sustainable city, so developing a sustainability agenda. And the approach that we've taken, which I really believe in, is we've been trying to lead the revitalization with great parks and public spaces. This is really kind of like going back to the 19th century. It's how Central Park was built and how most of New York City built around it. There was nothing where Central Park is. They didn't say, well, let's wait until there's demand for it, and then when there's enough need, we'll spend the money. They said, before this land gets built on, let's put this park in, and that will increase the real estate value and stimulate development, and that's exactly what happened. So that's the model we've been trying to use, putting these parks in place really before the communities are there. Critics like to, take us to task for that and say, oh, you built a park in the middle of nowhere. Well, that's kind of the point, which is the whole waterfront's the middle of nowhere, and you have to start putting some there. And what we're trying to do is sell public assets. Most of this land is owned publicly, and we're going to put it on the market to developers. We want to get the best price for it because that money comes back to the public. So when you put these investments in up front, the development community suddenly says, gee, I really want to build something there. And until these things are there, the development community is not quite as interested, and they're not going to pay as much money for the property. So convincing people to do this, though, is a trick. It was not an immediate slam dunk, but we did it, and I think the results have been very powerful. So just to show you these three major precincts we've been working on, this is what we call the East Bayfront. So this is just east of the Redpath Sugar Factory, south of the Gardner Expressway, if you know downtown Toronto. This is the land as it was about 10 years ago. This is a rendering of it rebuilt as a community with a park system that represents about close to 30% of the land area dedicated for open space, the rest for mixed-use development. Oops, had a little problem there with that label, I see. This is the site that was cleared for one of our parks that used to have some kind of derelict warehouses on it, and this became the site of Sherburne Common, which was designed by Philips Farvag Smallenberg from Vancouver. And the great thing about this park is that it's also our stormwater treatment facility for most of the waterfront. So the art sculptures that you see there are the last stage in the processing of stormwater that's collected, sediments taken out of it. It goes through a UV treatment processing system in the basement of the pavilion, and then is pumped through these aeration arms, goes through a little biofiltering wetland, and then becomes a water feature in the park. There's virtually no place in Canada where stormwater is taken and treated like that and made accessible to the public. Part of the reason is there are no standards for doing it. So these are the hurdles you run into. You say you want to do this, and everyone says, yeah, that's great, that's sustainable. And then the health department says, yeah, but we have no way to tell you if the water's clean enough. And then you say, well, okay, just give us a standard. And they say, well, we don't even know how to create a standard. So we had to go through a whole process of figuring out what the measurement standard would be that we would then use to measure the effectiveness of our system against once it was up and running. And we're still testing it against those criteria. But that's the challenge. The disconnect between the policy and the regulation is just, it's huger than you would ever suspect. The other big challenge that we always heard was, well, you shouldn't really build parks on the waterfront because it's cold and windy and no one will go there. But the magic answer to how to animate park space in Canada in the winter is to put an ice rink there. It's really easy. People use Sherburne Common, more people use it in the winter than in the summer, and it doesn't have a single building. Well, it now has George Brown College, but before that was there were no buildings around it, and people would go skate there. And this was a parking lot which was turned into Sugar Beach, and this is one of the things that Lola was referencing in terms of people being critical of the money. These umbrellas cost $12,000 each, and people think that that's, somehow some people think they know that that's a lot of money to pay for a hurricane-proof, permanent vandal-proof shade structure. I'm not sure why people think they know what the right cost of that ought to be, but they do. They have an opinion, and they're certain that $12,000 is too much because you can buy a flimsy umbrella from Home Depot for $1,000 and put it up in your backyard, and if you're lucky, it survives one season, right? So $12,000 has just got to be too much. These have been up for 3 years now, and they look the same as they did when we installed them. We've also worked with architectural firms on some of the buildings. So Diamond & Schmidt did the Chorus Entertainment building. Someone just fell asleep, so sorry about that. George Brown College, their medical center building designed by Kuwabara Payne McKenna Bloomberg, also right next to Sherburne Common. So starting to see the market response or the build-out response around these public spaces. One of the first condominium projects that will go up in the East Bayfront is called Moan. The design is actually by Moshe Safdie, who's never done a residential building in Toronto. And I'm proud about this only in the sense that because we've raised the bar on design excellence, developers are now bringing forward people of that caliber, whether you like Safdie's architecture or not. This is a developer that would never have hired an architect like that before they bid on our project. Same here, this is Bayside in Toronto by Hines Corporation. Actually, Tridell's doing the building, and this is Architectonica was selected for it. Again, a little bit higher than the bar that we get on a lot of our buildings in terms of the designer. Whether or not you like the design, that's another question. I still think it looks a little like it belongs in Miami, not in Toronto, but so be it. West Don Lands, this is what used to be called the Ataratiri lands. This is very east end of the city by the Don River. Again, a master plan here, in this case done by Urban Design Associates, Ray Gindros, who's one of the kind of grandfathers of new urbanism in the United States. Here we took land and again built a public realm first. This was a derelict bunch of traffic islands underneath 2 off-ramps from the Gardiner Expressway, turned into Underpass Park. This too is actually used by people, even though there are no people living near this yet. And it's generated a huge amount of public press for what's really a pretty small project, but the idea is to recapture this otherwise orphaned space. Corktown Common, probably our most successful park. This is built on top of a massive berm or flood protection landform because the Don River can flood. And when we started this project, the hydrologist said, well, it's a big berm. It can't really have anything growing on it because roots will weaken it. And we said, well, we'll have to figure out a solution to that. We hired Michael Van Valkenburg as the landscape architect, and he worked with the engineers and the hydrology folks and figured out that we could just add more topography. We were already building it up 2 meters, build it up another 1.5 meters, and then you've got the dimension you need for tree roots to grow without impacting the actual structural integrity. And so we now have one of the nicest parks in the city on something that people thought was just going to be hydro-seeded and allowed to turn into a lawn. And I think the big difference there is, had we done that, it wouldn't be an attraction. People wouldn't make a point of going there just to see some grass on a hillside. This is actually a usable, engaging environment with a pavilion by Mary Ann Thompson that anchors one of the biggest sort of children's play complexes in any park in the city now. River City Condominiums, this is the first condominium project in the West Don Lands. Here I think we really did hit a home run with the design. This is Saucier and Perrott from Montreal, came in with the developer Urban Capital, and I think they're doing something completely different than any of the residential we've seen going up in the city. Not to say there hasn't been some other good stuff, but this is a very new direction, I would say, for residential housing in the city of Toronto. We've also got a mandate to deliver affordable housing, so we have worked with Toronto Community Housing. Core Architects took the lead on this. It's right across the street from the River City project. Not quite at the same level, but for an affordable housing project, I think it's actually pretty good. And because our plans for this area were so endorsed by the community and already in place, when the province bid for the Pan Am Games, they chose the West Don Lands as the site for the Athletes Village. There's always an athletes accommodation area that goes with any of these large-scale games, and the biggest challenge is always getting the approvals to build it, not the actual building of it. So in this case, we had all the approvals in place, and this village is basically done. It's ahead of schedule. It's right on budget. It's probably one of the first times that's ever happened in an Olympics or a Pan Am Games. Think back to Vancouver, most recent Canadian example. Actually a terrific project, but went terribly over budget and barely got done on time. And then the Central Waterfront, this was already more or less built when we started. This gets me back to the point that I made. One of the first things we did was a design competition for Queens Quay, which was one of the ugliest streets in the city. It was all concrete, had no street trees, and at the slips where this water body is, had a 4-foot wide sidewalk separating the roadbed of Queens Quay from the dock wall edge, and that's where the 12 million visitors to our waterfront a year had to squeeze by. So the competition looked at how to improve circulation at the heads of slips, and we got this fantastic series of wave decks from the winning team, West 8 with DTAH. And we got this complete rethink of Queens Quay, which took the 2 south lanes of traffic away and turned them into a linear park, and consolidated all the traffic in 2 lanes on the north side. Even the biggest supporters of this project were very skeptical that we would ever get this approved, and that was even before Mayor Ford had become elected. But we got it approved. We did our environmental assessment. We didn't have any objections to it. We worked with every single property owner, hundreds and hundreds of meetings with people to change the design and change and rechange the design. And we're now building this, and it's going to be finished in a year. So that will be, though, 10 years from the time I launched this design competition until we open the street. So that's how long these things take. And this is just 1.5 kilometers of street. This is not, you know, a 20-mile Grand Boulevard through a new Asian city that's going to have 1 million inhabitants in its first year. That's how tough it is to get this stuff done. And we had Mayor Miller supporting this project while we were doing it too, and despite that, very, very difficult. So if you don't have the stamina to stick with it, you can't deliver these things. And that's just the reality. So you have to believe in it and you have to stay on top of it. And then you get the benefits. So we've done an analysis of the investment we've made. We've spent about $1.2 billion so far on the waterfront, and that's translated into about a $3 billion economic output for the Canadian economy, about $600 million in revenue back to the government through land sales and increased taxes, and about 16,000 full-time years of employment. So, the economic benefits are huge, but you have to be able to make that case. And, if you don't build the umbrellas and you don't build the parks, you don't get these benefits either. So that's the other side of the equation that gets forgotten. So we have 2 projects going on right now that I'll just leave you with. One is the ongoing saga of what to do with the Gardiner Expressway, which still remains quite up in the air, no pun intended. And the other one, which is much less up in the air, is the naturalization of the mouth of the Don River, which is a goal that the community's had for at least 30, 40 years, going back to Michael Huff, who wanted to really see this river taken out of the concrete channel and given back to nature. And we did a planning and design competition for this as well, which was won by Michael Van Valkenburg and an enormous team of other consultants that basically, rather than trying to tear out the Keating Channel, which you see there at the north end of the site, which had been the official plan of the city to sort of rip this to bits and kind of make a naturalized edge here, which would have been virtually impossible actually to implement. This team said, well, you've got all this vacant land down here in the Portlands, just move the mouth of the river, create a naturalized area, and then you create 2 new development neighborhoods that have the river as a centerpiece. And so this was a complete change in the way anyone had thought about what to do with the river, and it's something that would not have happened if it had only been up to the planners. And I always say this and worry that the planners are going to be mad at me because I'm a planner and I work with planners, but it's not really how they think necessarily. This was an idea that came out of Michael's vision for what the quality of the river really ought to be something spectacular, and that led him to say, let's put it where it's actually got space to be that kind of a thing. It's never going to have that space if we keep it where it is. And all of this land was a huge marsh. This was all the territory of the river mouth originally. So we're moving it, but we're only moving it from one man-made fake outlet to another man-made outlet. It used to have all this land and more to meander through. So this project actually, believe it or not, has more or less been approved now. We just about have our environmental approvals in place. It's a very expensive undertaking, but what's driving it is flood protection. The river's flood prone, and the naturalization is really just a piece of the project to flood protect without putting it into just a bigger concrete trench, and that's what this plan achieves. So we are in the process of getting money for this, and I think this thing will happen within the next 5 to 10 years, and this will be a change on a scale that few cities have ever seen. So that's it for my presentation.